there, you can certainly just comment from wherever you're watching this. So whether you're in the Zoom, whether you're out on Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube, wherever the heck you are, you can just comment right on the live stream, and I'll certainly bust in and ask the question for you there, Tim.
Excellent. And yes, so this is being broadcast out. So, you know, we don't know quite who all might be watching. So
no cussing.
Keep the cuss minimum. That's right. Dan, keep that in mind.
Well.
So, okay, this is a big class. We're probably have some discussion. This will take up the full hour and a half. If we have extra time, I've got a few extra slides. But this is my favorite class. It's the inspection contingency. It's so simple and makes sense, but it's really not. All the different unique situations that happen. There's a lot of different ways it can go. So I appreciate hearing your stories or scenarios that can kind of bring some of this academic thinking into real life. So with that said, I make these disclaimers sometimes in many of my classes. This is not legal advice. Of course, we always say that. But I think it's important to know or think of it, what's legally correct or what's technically correct doesn't always matter. Because if you're right and everybody else is wrong, you're probably going to be outnumbered. And unless somebody sues somebody and we go in front of the judge, being right is not what's most important. I think what's most important is making sure everybody's on the same page, making sure things are clear. Absolutely, we want to do things right, but we can't just be right and pound our fists and say we're right, because that doesn't always matter. Let's see. We cannot cover every possible scenario. And there is no right answer. There is no necessarily, this is how you do it all the time. So my goal today is just, let's start thinking about things in different ways so you can apply not just this solution, but come up with your own solution. It is Remax 1.1.
ONE1.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. All lowercase.
Okay.
Oh, the best practices, some things I'll recommend today, next month, next year, they may be different. So I don't believe this is being recorded, so it won't be a timely issue. Just know that things change. And sometimes I say some things wrong. So if you hear me say something wrong or you think you want to challenge it, go right ahead. It feels like the more I learn, the more I realize how much I don't know. So I always try to be open, and because just how to apply things to different situations, it's an ongoing journey. Okay, let's see. Oh, more disclaimers. There's no one best way. We touched on that. Consider the property, the buyer, the seller, the other agent, the market, the timing of everything. There's so many factors that go into it. The specific wording, like I said, I don't just want to say, here's the paragraph, use this all the time, because it won't work all the time. Balance thoroughness with simplicity. If you want to do it perfectly right, it might be a 2-page contingency, for example, but that's too long. But a sentence might be too short. So needs to be long enough or thorough enough to be good enough, but don't overcomplicate it. Be humble, ask questions. Absolutely. Okay, we're going to talk today about drafting the inspection contingency to benefit the buyer, and try to balance that, reviewing it from a seller's point of view, and how to execute. It's not uncommon at all that I'll get a call with a question about somebody who's been in real estate for 20 years and they're finally doing a notice, or they haven't done a notice of defects or something in that matter for 10 years, and they just forget, or they don't know if something's changed. So as you go through class, it's easy to understand it, but in real life, it's very easy to question yourself and not sure if you're doing it right. I welcome all those calls, because a lot of times just talking it through, walking it through, you think you know it, you just want to double check and make sure you're not missing something. I love that. That's just a safe way to practice real estate. Okay. drafting the inspection contingency. Discuss this with the buyer at the time of writing the offer. Discuss how all of this works. Now, this can be a 45-minute conversation with the buyer. So there again, you have to balance. You don't have that much time because the buyers usually aren't going to pay attention for that long. But there are some points you want to cover. Set the expectation that the inspector is not going to catch everything. They're going to find things living in the house for the first 6 months that the inspector wouldn't be possible to find out in a 2-hour, 3-hour inspection. So just set that expectation up front that they're going to do a lot more thorough showing than we did on our showing, but they won't catch everything. Let them know that we need to provide a copy of the report. This isn't so important to let them know ahead of time, but we'll touch on this later too. And remember that, because I guess I just gave you the answer to a future question. Let the buyer know that the seller can kill the deal if the buyer delivers a notice of defects. We'll touch on that later too, but I think this is important that they know that ahead of time. But I'll stop there until we get to that point later. Let them know what the process is, how the process works with a notice technically, and then how it typically works in practice with the amendment. Just let them know what the different options are and how that might play out. Consider how many days there are when you're drafting this. How many days is your inspection contingency? How long is it taking to get inspectors out there in the current market? Does it take 7 days? Can you call and get an inspection scheduled tomorrow? Just make sure you allow enough time. Right to cure, have a discussion about that. Just, it's better for the buyer if the seller does not have a right to cure. But again, especially today, we're trying to get these offers accepted. So it's been a while since I've seen seller shall not have the right to cure. Even in a non-competitive market, typically we give the seller the right to cure. If you're competing, is the inspection contingency being waived? Are you adding in a buffer? Talk about these things with the buyer. There's no right answer here. I just try to keep in mind that our job is to educate our clients and let them know, here's one option, here's the pros and cons, here's another option. Let them make the decision, but we're the guides. Do you need separate contingencies for anything that are outside of the inspection contingency? Mold, asbestos, radon, things like that. Questions so far? Okay, we'll keep rocking here. So a little quiz or question or discussion point. The condition report discloses electrical box wiring may not be correct, or something is disclosed, but the buyer wants to inspect it more anyways. That kind of tips them off to say, oh, well, I don't know about that. I don't want that to be excluded from something that doesn't fall within the inspection contingency. Buyer says, I want to look into that more. How do you do that? Any quick thoughts on, is the question clear, and any quick thoughts on how to execute that?
The real estate condition report section, we usually put like signed by the buyers, but adding in something about like the electrical box wiring may not be correct, will be further inspected.
I wouldn't put
I would
it
use that exact verbiage.
right. I wouldn't change. I wouldn't do anything on the actual condition report.
No, but in the section of the offer.
What would you write there?
Well, I would have to look at the exact verbiage that portion states, but I think it's something about like buyer acknowledges and has received like a copy of this real estate condition report. I would probably put something along the lines of this needs like further inspection because may not be correct is very vague.
So what you're talking about is, and this is a good spot to bring this up. Oh, I need to move this over. That's not as easy. Well, I'm just going to read it. I don't believe it's sharing on the screen, but the part you're talking about is on the residential, not the condo form, the offer to purchase, line 105, bottom of page 2, property condition representations. It says Seller represents to buyer that as of the date of acceptance, seller has no notice or knowledge of conditions affecting the property or transaction other than those identified in the seller's real estate condition report dated such and such, which was received by the buyer prior to signing this offer. Okay, that's kind of common knowledge. That's what we all think. And then there's blanks. So if you put anything in those blanks, that's really when you would acknowledge that, okay, you disclosed 3 things in the condition report. We're also aware of this. Whether you became aware of it, whether it was verbally told to you, maybe there was a discussion between the agents and something else came up, and does that need to be disclosed? Maybe you say, as you're writing the offer, I'll just write it in the offer so it's disclosed that way. So there's a reason for that. Very seldom do I ever see anything entered here, but in that spot is where you would put something like that, additional disclosures. What you're talking about, I wouldn't put here. If we write something, I would do that in additional provisions. While we're here, this part, when we talk about, for example, a couple things come to mind. As is sales, which is a whole other topic. But more importantly, the idea that sometimes condition reports aren't required. They don't have to be filled out, or their sellers are exempt from filling that out. The requirement to fill out a condition report and the requirement to disclose, for a seller to disclose what they know, those are 2 separate things. You could be exempt, a seller could be exempt from completing a condition report, but that doesn't mean they can't hide stuff. If they know things are wrong, that stuff still needs to be disclosed. And there's probably other reasons, but this is one very specific reason. You write the offer, unless this wording is modified, and I've never seen it modified. When the seller signs this offer, they're essentially agreeing to this statement, which says, seller represents to buyer that as of the date of acceptance, seller has no notice or knowledge of conditions affecting the property. So the seller is stating that there's nothing wrong with the property. So if they're exempt from completing the condition report and they know something's wrong with the property, they need to disclose that, or they're lying when they sign the offer. So that's one of those little technicalities of, you can be exempt, you still need to disclose. You can't hide stuff. So let me jump to number 1. If you want to say, hey, maybe there's one thing, maybe that was the only thing on the condition report that was disclosed, and you want to be able to have that included in the inspection contingency. There is a spot that says in the inspection contingency, when you're able to object to defects that you didn't previously know about. So it really applies to the inspection contingency. Well, this is actually it. You could just cross this out, and this basically eliminates the entire condition report. In the single family offer, lines 210 and 211, for the purposes of this contingency, defects do not include structural, mechanical, or other conditions, the nature, extent of which buyer had actual knowledge or written notice before signing this offer. That statement is why we can't object to defects that have been disclosed. So if you cross that out, everything becomes available again. Another option.
Buyer, residential offer to purchase, or the new one?
It is, that's the new one. So these line numbers are correct. And actually, I think line number wise, I think they're the same, the old one and the new one. Dano?
We got one question online. If they're exempt and then a defect is discovered after the offer is accepted, what form is used to disclose this? As there is only a seller refusal to complete, so can't use an amendment to the condition report, is what it says.
It needs, if a material adverse fact is discovered, it needs to be disclosed in writing to all parties. Arguably, that could potentially be an email. That
Okay.
would be in writing. It could be a notice, it could be an amendment. The form itself is not so much what's important, it's just the fact that the disclosure is made and there's documentation.
Perfect.
It doesn't necessarily have to be a part of the offer, but that disclosure should be made.
Great question, Beth. Thanks.
Okay, if there's 4 things disclosed in the condition report, and there's one thing that you want to be able to do further inspecting on, here's a sample of what you could say. Regarding, and this would be in the additional provision section, regarding item B2 in the real estate condition report, which discloses electrical box wiring may not be correct, the buyer reserves the right to object to this condition as a defect through the inspection contingency if deemed a defect by the home inspector. There's no magic to that language. There's maybe better language, but just know that if this comes up and the buyer says, well, I don't want to just accept that, I don't know enough about it, I want to be able to look into that more, just know that that's a thing. You can do that. You can kind of reserve that right. And that's one way to do it. And if you get to that point, I guess a lot of times my goal for these classes is just know that these things are there. 2 years from now, when this situation comes up, hopefully you remember, I know there was a way to do that. Just call me and then I'll point you to the right direction. So you don't need to know, you don't need to necessarily remember how to do it. Just remember that it can be done. This is another little nuance that can be very important. Nature and extent. So again, as it applies to the inspection contingency, what you can't object to, we often think if it's disclosed, you can't object to it. True, except there's 2 pieces to that. If you knew about the nature and extent of the defect, you can't object to it through the inspection contingency. Oftentimes we know about the nature, we don't always know about the extent. And this is key because everybody, not everyone, most sellers try to minimize, and a lot of listing agents try to minimize the defect. And, you know, such as, oh, when there's a monsoon and it rains for days, we get a tiny little bit of water in the basement. Hey, I disclosed there's water in the basement, right? And then the inspector comes in and says, wow, it looks like there's signs that there's been 6 inches of water in the basement here. And the buyer says, whoa, I thought it was a tiny little bitty problem. And now the inspector is saying it's kind of a big problem. Can that buyer legitimately object to the defect through the inspection contingency? I would say so. They knew the nature of it, but they didn't know the extent of it. So whether you're on the buyer side, seller side, those 2 words and extent are important to know about, you know, as you're seeing how the condition report is filled out, or if you have to disclose something, and also from the buy side, if something's dramatically worse than what you thought it was, I wouldn't call this a loophole. I would just call this is the way it is. Know though that if you're going to object to something like that, you may get some resistance, and a seller and a listing agent may say, whoa, you can't do that. We disclosed that. Well, that's when you know where to point them to, that language. You minimized it. It's apparently a much bigger deal than what was disclosed. So know you might get resistance, but know that that's an option. Okay, I'm not seeing this as much anymore, but a lot of people were taught decades ago, when you're filling out the inspection contingency, you write in entire premises. And I still see that today. And it's just the way people were taught to do it. And maybe in an old form, maybe it made more sense. But here, the inspection contingency, this offer is contingent on a Wisconsin registered or Wisconsin licensed home inspector performing a home inspection of the property. That's it. That line, the default language, gives the home inspector the right to inspect. So the second one is for if something specific needs to be inspected. And by default, let's say, for example, a swimming pool. Well, most inspectors are going to say, I'm not a swimming pool expert, and they're going to write in the report, recommend you have a qualified person come in and inspect the pool because I don't do that. Or an invisible fence, or a roof. Hey, your roof looks, I found this and this and this. They're certainly going to inspect that. Or for example, an HVAC professional. There's a lot of things that an inspector recommends you have somebody else come in and inspect, more of a professional. Line 200, buyer may have follow-up inspections recommended in a written report resulting from an authorized inspection. So pool, furnace, you have your inspection in 7 days, you get the report back, great. We do want to bring in an HVAC professional to look at the furnace. Now you have, by default, the ability to do that, except you're probably going to run out of time. If you wait to have the inspection to get the report back, then call the schedule. So if you know when you're writing the offer that you want a pool person to come in and inspect the pool, that's what lines 197 and 198 are for. Don't write entire premises in there. Typically, you don't have to write anything in there. But the examples, let's see, swimming pool, roof, foundation, chimney. If you know you want to bring in somebody special, write that in there right away so you can get that scheduled right away. Okay, question. Legitimate defects were found in the inspection. Buyer has formally asked in multiple amendments for reasonable repairs to be made. Seller has not agreed. Buyer thinks a notice of defects should be given and asks how that works. Buyer does not want to lose the property. You explain that by delivering a notice objecting to defects, you are opening up the option for the seller to terminate the deal. The buyer says, that's dumb. You agree. And you think, man, this stinks. This is not something we think about when we're writing offers. It's no big deal until it is. And 9 out of 10 or 19 out of 20 times, the inspection is good, or we deal with it with an amendment versus a notice. This never even comes up. When it does come up, and then the buyer realizes that, wait, I could lose the deal if I object to a defect. Well, I didn't realize that risk was out there. This is something you should discuss with the buyer when you're writing the offer, because there is a way to change that. Because right now you give a seller a notice of defects. They can elect to cure the defects. They can do nothing, after which 10 days, the deal is dead, or they can elect not to cure the defects and the deal is dead. So, and that's fair. The idea behind that is this inspection contingency is to find defects bad enough that are deal breakers. So if it's not a deal breaker, don't give a notice. That's kind of the idea behind the way it is. And that's fine. And that's fine for a lot of people. But from a buyer point of view and from a buyer agent point of view, this is a good option to put out there to say, hey, this is how it works. Would you like me to modify the offer so that if we do get to the point where we have to deliver a notice of defects, that the seller can't terminate the deal? The seller can either elect to cure or elect not to cure, or do nothing. If they elect not to cure or they do nothing, the ball goes back in the buyer's court, and then the buyer gets the final decision as to they want to move forward with no repairs being made, or the buyer can terminate the deal. Now, the next slide or slides, I'm going to show what's the wording for that. And so you know that it's an option. Now, it's messy. So the reason, certainly in the last few years, as we're competing, I haven't written that in years, because it's messy. It's better for the buyer, not the seller. But as the market changes and levels out a little bit, we can start adding in these protections. Whether you think it's going to be used or not, it's still a good opportunity to explain how this works to the buyer ahead of time, rather than at the time where they're thinking about giving a notice. And you can explain, makes your offer look less attractive, but it gives you more protection. And a lot of times a buyer is going to say, that's fine. I mean, if it comes to that, I'm looking for deal breakers. If I'm not ready for the deal to die, I'm fine with that. But again, give them that option. Okay, we covered those points. So I'm not going to go into this too much. I'm not going to read that whole thing to you, but basically to implement this, lines 222 to 226 in the residential offer, condo offer, it's different lines, but the same wording, where it says this offer shall be after a defect is objected to, after the notice is given. This offer shall be null and void if buyer makes timely delivery of the notice of defects and written inspection report, and seller does not have the right to cure, then it would be automatically dead. Or seller has the right to cure, but seller delivers written notice that they elect not to cure, or they do nothing. And after 10 days, then it dies. So we're getting rid of the language that talks about the seller terminating. So we get rid of that, and then we replace that language with what I wrote in down here, which it's not elegant. It's kind of messy. Maybe it can be written better, but it works. It's technically right. It basically says if the seller doesn't agree to cure, goes back into the buyer's court, then the buyer can decide if they want to move forward or not. Questions on that? Cool. Yes.
It's kind of getting confused, but it's a roundabout way of doing this with its own risks, but let's say you don't want to add that verbiage because you don't want to foreshadow, like, yeah, we are going to be a stickler on the defects and have issues with that.
Yep.
So, you know, of course, we don't want it to get to that point, but that might make a seller nervous. If we don't add that in, and then we do end up going through the notice process, and the seller's like, nope, we're not going to cure anything. So technically the deal is done. If we still have communications with the listing agent, how would we just add that or like reverse it kind of, and the buyer be like, okay, fine, well, we still want the house.
Once you give notice, there is no reversing. There's no unilaterally reversing. After you give a notice, you can still do an amendment. But you can't, once that cat's out of the bag, it's gone. So once you deliver that notice, if the seller's got a secondary offer that's better and they're looking for a way to terminate, you deliver that notice objecting to defects, seller can terminate and buyer cannot stop it. Does that answer it? Or it has its own risk for sure. Yep. Yep. The mutual agreement. Yeah. So even after a notice is given, you can certainly still do an amendment that says anything that's agreed to. Yep. Okay. Competing. This is a longer conversation and I'll try not to make it too long. And I know I'm going to get some pushback on, well, that language is ugly. I've seen more elegant looking language, but it looks like Swiss cheese with all the holes in it. And sometimes that's okay. If you're using language, or if you're on the listing side and you receive language with a bunch of holes in it or gray areas, I think you have to kind of look at it and have a discussion with your client of, it could be interpreted this way. It could mean this. It could mean anything in between. We don't know exactly what they're thinking, but here's what it says. And here's the issues with what it says. I think you have to look at worst case client. This is worst case for you. If it's written this way, it could be better, but if you're going to accept this or write it this way and it gets accepted, if it's gray, your client needs to be okay with the worst case scenario of that. That's when I think it's okay to either write or allow simple language, because it looks good, yet language that has too many gray areas, in my opinion. So the biggest thing as we write these inspection buffers, my biggest concern is that the language a lot of times attempts to define the amendment process versus the notice process. And the notice process in the offer says buyer has the right to do this, buyer can do this. It's a one-way, applies in every instance, buyer has the right to do this. When buyer does this, objecting to defects, Seller has the right to do this. It's very well defined. There's no ambiguities. Most of the time, though, we do an amendment, and it's always different. So a lot of times when I see these inspection buffers, it's talking of the inspection buffers talk about, we're not going to propose an amendment, or we'll agree on this in the future, or it's attempting to define the amendment process, which is all woogity. The amendment process can go 100 different ways. That cannot be defined up front because we don't know what it is. So just keep in mind as we talk through this, that the notice is very linear. You can do this, then they can do that, but it's very linear and very specific. The amendment process is all over the place. So as we put together these inspection buffers, don't try to change or modify or control that amendment process, because you can't. Because the amendment process, we can do anything that's agreed to in the future. But we need to define the notice process, because if we can't agree on an amendment, what happens? We don't want to get to a point where we're stalled. Nobody has the right to do anything unless it's agreed to. With that in mind, I've got really 3 examples. And the top one is the simplest wording, but it can be a little confusing. So it says, buyer has been advised of the merits. I'm sorry, but the top one is actually if a seller is, a buyer is waiving the home inspection. I would recommend adding this language in. This is in the clause managers in zip forms and in SkySlope. It says buyer has been advised of the merits of having a professional home inspection and the risks of not having a home inspection. Buyer understands that real estate licensees are not qualified as home inspectors. Buyer has chosen to not include a home inspection contingency in this offer. Doesn't really say anything material in the offer, but it alerts the listing agent and the seller that, hey, the buyer and the buyer's agent have had a discussion. They're aware of the risks. They're choosing not to do this. So this type of language, I think, makes the seller feel better. If they get an offer with no inspection contingency and this language, it looks better. And it's good for us as licensees to kind of force us to have that conversation with them and to have it documented. So the next one, the bottom one, is where this is fairly simple inspection buffer language. If buyer delivers to seller a notice objecting to defects through the inspection contingency, and seller delivers a notice to buyer electing to cure the defects. So basically, there were defects. We objected to them. Seller is going to fix them. Okay, because these are all things that can happen. Then what happens? Well, the purchase price shall be increased by the total amount of costs incurred by seller to make repairs, as documented by paid receipts up to a maximum of $2,000. Because a question comes up, I think a big gray area when we talk about a $2,000 buffer. How does that get implemented? If we get to that point, we can't just leave that up in the air, assuming we'll figure that out later in an amendment. Well, I mean, you probably figure it out, but the point of writing we should be figuring that out now. Now, I've never seen it actually happen this way, but it's good to have a backdrop of, if we can't figure it out any other way, how is this going to play out? And this defines how it plays out if you can't agree on how it's going to play out. However, this confuses listing agents. So when I send this, and I've got another solution coming up on the next slide, but when I send this, if I use that language in an email, I would put this explanation. Let me know if you have any concerns about how I worded the inspection contingency buffer. Our intent is that if defects are found, we won't ask for anything if the total is expected to be under $2,000. If it would likely be more, then we'd factor in the $2,000 into any discussions we'd have about an amendment, but I doubt that we'll find anything that significant. I write it like I did in the offer because it specifies what happens if we can't otherwise agree to an amendment, and it eliminates loopholes and ambiguities. And that's a lot to read, but it's, that's what I would put in my email when I'm sending the offer over. Now, that's what I did maybe 2 years ago. Now I do this. I put all of this in the offer. It's kind of the actual buffer and that note, but just kind of condensed. So I know that the message gets to the seller. The first paragraph says, this is what actually counts. This is what's going to happen in the notice process. The second part, the note, it doesn't really do anything to the offer. It's just, hey, just so you know, we'll keep this in mind, which really, if you're talking about what you're going to do in an amendment in the future, that's all you can do is say that our intent is to do this, because if you don't end up signing an amendment in the future, none of it matters. So the note is just, it is the buyer's intent that if an amendment regarding the inspection contingency is proposed, the amendment would take into consideration the buyer's paying for the first $2,000 of any expected repair costs. And what I found is generally, you don't need estimates. You don't need anything too fancy. You just make a reasonable request. You say, hey, we found these 5 things. We think it's going to cost about this much for this, 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 and this. It adds up to 5,000. We think that's reasonable. We said we'd cover the first 2. So here's an amendment asking for a $3,000 closing cost credit. We'll call the inspection contingency good. That's generally how I see that play out. And everybody says, sure, that sounds reasonable, and it gets signed. And that's fine. But if that doesn't work out, we need to have that defined. Well, how is it going to work in the notice process? So let me get all of these. Okay. And there's probably more, but the things that came to mind when I think of, as I read inspection buffers, what do I look for? What are the ambiguities that I see? And what should you be looking for? Questions you should be asking. Is the amendment process trying to be dictated ahead of time, which is impossible and ineffective, or is it referring to the notice process? Keep that in mind. Stating that the buyer will not propose an amendment. This one just bugs me. Buyer agrees not to propose an amendment if this and this and this. Well, those if statements are all subjective, right? Well, what if not everybody agrees if those if statements are satisfied or not? And you can always propose an amendment. You could propose an amendment that says, how about we remove the language that says I won't propose an amendment? I mean, are you in breach of contract if you propose an amendment? I hate that wording. Again, it can be used, but it creates loopholes. Is it a per defect cost or total cost? This has been better addressed lately. Early on, years ago, when this started being used, it was often unclear when we're talking about a $500 or $2,000, $5,000 repair. Is it per repair? So if you had 10 $1,000 repairs, the way some buffers are worded, nothing would kick in because no individual repair costs enough. But usually I think the intent is the total cost of repairs, but that should be very specific. The way I worded it, doesn't matter. If the buyer wants to object, purchase price goes up, and it's all covered that way. How is the cost determined? This one is very unrealistic, I think, to get done in a timely manner. If we need contractors to get quotes, well, maybe you can get a contractor in and get a quote in time before the end of the inspection contingency period. But what if the buyer or the seller says, well, I don't like that. I want to get my own, or you don't like it. Should you have 2 or 3? Or it's just, again, it's creates too many potential for loopholes and disagreements. Is there sufficient time? That's that one. If repairs are made and buyer pays for a portion, how is this executed? This very often is not determined. It may say buyer will cover or pay for the first $2,000. Well, what if the seller actually makes repairs and that $2,000 is going to be covered by the buyer? How? Does the buyer pay the contractor? Is the purchase price raised? Does the buyer cut a check now while repairs are being made? Do they cut a check at closing? So that's how is it going to be done? I see some eyeballs. Is that come up?
No.
Oh, that was something different.
Let me just check again.
Okay.
Making sure it's still here.
That's good. No nodding off or anything.
Everybody awake? Everybody, yeah, all right.
Excellent. Okay. I guess I beat that one to death a little bit, but again, that language is out in the clause managers. I am making one update to the Sky Slope clause manager. Some of that language is out there, but I need to add one yet. And again, if you don't have to use that language. I like the language because it's very specific and it will keep you out of trouble. But again, sometimes simple is better, but if it's simple and has loopholes, know what the worst case is. Make sure your client knows what the worst case is. Okay, protect your seller, what to look for when reviewing an offer as far as the inspection contingency goes. So you're the listing agent, you get the offer, what should you look for? Does the seller have the right to cure? Time frame. Will the seller have time to make repairs? Because if the buyer's looking for a way out, they get cold feet. Oftentimes, the buyer, an out will probably present itself, because a lot of times sellers don't follow all the rules that they should. When if defects are objected to, seller elects to cure. Do they cure them all in a good and workmanlike manner? And do they do everything they need to? We'll touch on that here in a few slides later. But keep in mind that if it's a 30-day closing and a 15-day inspection contingency, and you get the notice of defects on day 15, you've got to have those done and a written report given by day 27. So is it possible to get that done in 12 days, potentially after they give you a notice? Just something to keep in mind. What is being inspected? Everything, or is there just anything specific being looked at? Is the standard inspection contingency in the offer being used? That's what we're familiar with, but sometimes that's not checked and there's a separate addendum A with a specific inspection contingency. Oh boy, now quite honestly, we're practicing law if we're interpreting an inspection contingency that's not the standard inspection contingency. So, but that's one of those gray areas that, not that it's right, but it's common. So we kind of need to deal with it, but be careful and make your disclosures that here's how I'm reading it, but to interpret this seller and tell you exactly what this means, I would be practicing law. You could review it with them, but again, we're all pretty good at this, I think. Always recommend they consult with an attorney. But just know that there could be a difference, and read those carefully and try to look for those differences. Has anything been struck out? Even if they're using the standard contingency, has anything been struck out? Because as we noted, just striking out a line or two can make a big difference. Has anything been modified from the custom language or a clause added? Are there things such as if a follow-up inspection is recommended by the inspector, we get an automatic 5-day extension just for that piece. That a lot of times these things aren't good, bad. It's just important to know and explain that to the seller, what all that means, and keep your time frames in mind. Back to a buyer agent. Setting up the inspection. Do not hire the inspector for the buyer. Buyer says, hey, can you just set that up for me? And you go ahead and call your inspector and arrange it, and buyer hasn't even met or talked to the inspector. Don't do that. You're putting yourself squarely in the middle of being wrong when eventually the buyer finds something after closing and gets mad at the inspector, and they say, well, you hired him for me, and you would be in trouble if they push that. So definitely don't hire the inspector for the buyer. Now, it's best practice not to recommend a particular inspector, but we do. I mean, the reality is your buyers want your advice. They want to use somebody that's trusted, that you've used before. So we often will say, well, I like this person. When you do that, don't give them just one, give them 3, let them call. Maybe you give a little note about each of them and say, but buyer, you need to decide. I would recommend you call each of them, get their pricing, chat with them a little bit, and you decide. once they decide to hire a particular inspector, I think it's fine for you to coordinate the scheduling of that to make sure it fits your schedule, buyer schedule, inspector schedule. Just don't do the actual hiring. I think we all know this, but try to leave some time, at least a few days, ideally, between the inspection and the deadline for the inspection contingency. More time, the better. Set the buyer's expectations ahead of time as much as you can, such as bring your checkbook to the inspection if the inspector likes to be paid that way. How long is it going to take? 2 hours, 3 hours, hour and a half, depends on the property, depends on the inspector, but let the buyer know. Will you be there? Please be there. You don't have to be there. You're not required to be there. In my opinion, if you're not there, you're not giving as good of service as you otherwise could. If something comes up in the inspection and a defect, and the buyer wants to talk to you about it, and you weren't there to see it, to have a discussion with the inspector about it, or the listing agent questions something and you can't answer basic questions about this defect because you weren't there, I think it doesn't allow you to represent your client as well as you can. But sometimes you just can't make it. If you can't make it for the whole thing, at least try to be there for the end, so you can get the summary and you can look at anything that you need to look at. But it's my recommendation that you do that, not a requirement though. Again, as you're talking with the buyer, setting expectations, are you going to follow the inspector around? Are you just going to kind of hang out in the kitchen and chit chat, which is oftentimes what happens? The inspector, we follow the inspector around for 5 or 10 minutes, and then the inspector keeps going, and we end up chit chatting in the kitchen until the inspector says, "Hey, I found something." Really, any way you want to do that is good, as long as you're able to see when the inspector finds something worth looking at least you're there to look at it. But it's okay to follow the inspector around. Let the buyer know how it can play out, and let the buyer make that decision. I let the buyer know the inspection's a great opportunity to get to know the home, ask questions of the inspector, rather than just identifying defects. It's more valuable than just that. So buyers should also be there as much as possible, and both buyers, if there's two, ideally, it's just a good opportunity. Certain things are not allowed. Again, letting a buyer know this ahead of time is good. I've seen buyers, because I didn't catch them in time. You know, it's a house built in the 60s or 70s with the old dark paneling in the basement, and it's kind of warped and peeling off, and they just peel it back a little bit. You can hear the nails popping out. They're just taking a peek behind. I'm like, oh, you can't do that. But keep an eye on your buyers, but let them know ahead of time that we can't. I use that as an example. We can't be peeling back paneling to look behind it. We can't move significant personal property to gain access to things. Let the inspector do their thing, because they know what they can and can't do. And buyer, you can't walk on the roof. Don't allow, and you shouldn't walk on a roof either. My goodness. But sometimes, you know, they want to get up there and look around too, but don't allow it.
Tim, just to remind everybody, I'm not going to say the agent's name, but we did have an agent fall off a roof and hurt themselves. So that was not funny advice. That's probably really good real advice.
Real advice, yes. Okay. Is it a defect? Who determines what is or is not a defect? Ultimately, the real answer to that is the judge. Other than that, we're just all talking, right? You don't get to decide what's a defect. The buyer and seller don't. The buyer can think one thing, the seller can think another. And we're kind of in the middle, and our job is to find the common ground. And certainly we can argue our point of that's obviously not a defect, or it is, or that's kind of our job to argue whatever side we're trying to argue. But ultimately there is definitely some gray area in this inspection contingency. Maybe a year or 2 years ago, the inspector started labeling, this is a defect. This is a maintenance type item. And my first thought was, that's not really going to change anything, because the inspectors don't determine what defects are, because they're not a party to our offer. It's the buyer and seller that get to decide. If the buyer thinks it's a defect, they can object to it. If the seller doesn't agree that it's a defect, they can say, I don't agree that it's a defect. Well, then we're arguing. We try to find that middle ground. I had a discussion with the legal hotline. Their stance on it was that the inspector saying it's a defect carries a lot of weight, more so than I thought that it would, because now it puts it on the inspector, which use this however you want. If it's something in the gray area and the inspector said defect, well, that's great. As a buyer, if you want to use that, obviously you're going to say the inspector said it's a defect. On the flip side, if something's maybe legitimate, but the inspector didn't put it in the defect column, as a listing agent, as a seller, I'm going to say your inspector didn't call that a defect. You can argue either side. You might be saying one thing and another thing on the same day on different deals, but use it when you can. There is one difference that comes into play now and then. The definition of a defect for an inspector, and I may get this wrong, but it's so help me out if I'm saying it wrong, is safety hazard. That's a common one. The other one is something that if not fixed, will continue to cause more damage, something to that effect. And so there's two things that the inspector uses. Our offer, however, has three things in the offer that define a defect. That third one has a significant effect on the value of the property. Well, in my opinion, that, and again, on the buy side, if you're trying to use something that's not a defect in the report, I would point to that language and say, well, this obviously has a significant effect on the value of the property. Therefore, it meets our criteria in the offer of what a defect is. Is that a loophole? Kind of seems like one. If the inspector in the offer has different criteria for what a defect is, I believe it does open up a little bit of a loophole. So know that that's an argument you can make if you need to, if you're trying to get something on the buy side counted as a defect that's not labeled as a defect.
Any questions there? I feel like that's one we, get questions on a lot.
Mm-hmm.
No? All right.
Cool. Okay. Inspection report. Once you get the inspection report, review it with the buyers. Make sure everything that was mentioned is actually in the report. I've seen this many times. We go around the house, we talk about things. Oh yeah, something gets pointed out. We get the report, it's not in the report. And it's certainly okay to go back to the inspector and say, hey, remember we talked about this? I don't see that in the report. Maybe it's in there and you just didn't look in the right spot, or maybe the inspector says, oh, sorry, I forgot, I'll add that in there. That is certainly fine to do. It's not really okay to try to twist the inspector's arm and get them to put something in the report or move something around just because you want them to. And a good inspector, I think, would consider your request, and if it's reasonable, make a change, but wouldn't lie. But know that it's okay to talk to the inspector and have that change. If you deliver the report and later come up with a revised report, that's probably not going to look so good. So look at this right away and try to make those changes up front, if any changes need to be made. When reviewing the report, sometimes a buyer gets it and says, I want this, this, this. Well, great. I would still have some discussion. Are you okay with not getting that fixed? And just discuss it with them. But sometimes they make it very easy. Sometimes they have no idea. They're looking to you to say, I don't know, I'd like it all fixed, but I don't need any of it fixed. What do you think? Can we get them to fix something? So you talk through options. A lot of times I'll summarize it because you'll get a 50-page inspection report when really the things we're dealing with are 10 bullet points. And I'll put everything that's mentioned in my list, and I'll say, well, these are just maintenance items. These are the important ones. Here's kind of the middle ground, just to facilitate the discussion more. And ultimately the buyer is going to decide what they want to object to. And it's not always about defects. Sometimes it's about they're looking for a way to get out of the offer, or or they definitely don't want the offer to fall apart. All this plays into how you negotiate. Okay.
Tim, would you ever ask the inspector for their, like, for help prioritizing the business?
Can you restate
have-
that? Tim, can you restate the question real quick?
Have I ever asked an inspector to help prioritize the items? So, you know, there's 10 things mentioned. What's the most important? I haven't, but that's not a bad idea to do. That would be a good discussion to have with the buyer present, just so the buyer knows whether they get the seller to fix them or not. These are the most important things that after closing, if they're not fixed, focus on these first. So good question, with a few different reasons to do that. Seller asks for a copy of the inspection report. Buyer doesn't plan on asking for any repairs. Do you have to deliver it? I'm not going to wait for an answer because I gave you the answer before. Yes. You do need to deliver it. You already have the buyer's permission. In the offer, there's a boilerplate section that basically says you have to provide a copy of any testing or inspection reports. You have to provide those. Now, if the seller or listing agent says, I don't want to see it, and sometimes I've had sellers do that because if they're thinking the deal's going to fall apart because they know there's a whole bunch of things wrong with it, they don't want to have that knowledge, because once they have the knowledge, they would need to disclose it. So I've had sellers or listing agents say, don't give it to me. As a buyer's agent, you could still send it over, but you don't have to send it over if they're saying, no, I don't want it. But if they say, generally, you should just send it. What I do, especially if there's, say, 20 defects listed, but we're only going to ask for 10 of them. Usually I'll just send it over with no a comment, but nothing too specific. I'll say, hey, here's the inspection report. We just got this back. I'm still working with the buyer. We're going to, he's thinking about it. We're going to talk about this tomorrow. I'll be in touch. So I don't say, hey, we're only going to ask for 10. I don't minimize everything. I don't say, hey, this deal is going to fall apart. I don't, no real comments. I just send it, say, we'll be in touch, and I let them stew on it. Because chances are a seller is going to read an inspection report and think, oh man, there's a lot of things on here. I'm sure the buyer is going to ask for everything. Let them sit with that thought for a day or two. Then when you come through with an amendment that's not asking for everything, hopefully they're a little more agreeable to it. So I use that. I just send it over anyways ahead of time.
I've seen that be a big mess recently, especially with the buffers and offers of purchase. If it's plausible that buffer, I'm having to ask for that inspection report more and more. Because people aren't, it's kind of like being treated as an appraisal contingency right now, whereas if there's no issue,
nothing happens. Yep. And
Like it does make people stew, because like you are looking through it and being like, shit. I mean, it's like getting your labs back on my chart before your doctor says, you know,
Right.
what it means.
yeah.
You're like, I'm dying. How's it going?
there's also a strategy.
For sure, yeah. It kind of,
That's the seller's too.
yeah.
Mhm.
It almost like that. It gives you leverage without even doing anything, right?
Yep. Time in everything. I think time and patience are very powerful, whether it's negotiating this, whether it's just whether somebody's really angry. The knee-jerk reaction is always very different typically than the response the next day. So use that to your advantage. Okay, buyer's options for how to proceed. If defects are found, buyer could do nothing, just let it lapse and accept everything. Buyer could propose a solution, or buyer agent. You talk verbally and come up with a solution, then follow up with that in writing in an amendment. Buyer can deliver a written amendment. Buyer can deliver a notice of defects. Buyer could deliver a cancellation agreement, or deliver any combination of those. Could be all three of those at the same time. So there's a lot of options, and even if an option is obviously the buyer's not going to choose an option, or seller's not going to, I still list those options just so they know all their options, and we've covered it. An amendment. Okay, when you propose an amendment, the right way to say the inspection contingency is satisfied is that, and that's it. You don't need fancy words. What I hate is The inspection contingency is satisfied if the seller agrees to make the following repairs. So think of it this way, when an amendment is signed, whatever the amendment says, the seller is agreeing to. If you say if, the buyer and seller just agreed that the inspection contingency is satisfied if the seller agrees to make the following repairs. When that amendment is signed by the seller, that seller is not agreeing to make repairs. That seller is agreeing to have an option to make repairs. And if they do make repairs, the inspection contingency is satisfied. I would argue that with that word if, a seller could choose not to make repairs. And if they don't make repairs, the inspection contingency is not satisfied. But likely when the buyer figures this out, the inspection contingency timeframe has lapsed. So this is kind of nitpicky, but just don't put the word if in there. Just say inspection contingency is satisfied, seller shall make the following repairs, blah, blah, blah. That's the better way to do it. In addition to saying the inspection contingency is satisfied, that's what the seller gets. What does the buyer get? Could be repairs, could be a credit, could be a purchase price reduction, could be anything. Paint the bedroom blue, right? That's not a defect, but if that's what you want, I mean, you whatever's agreed to can be put in that amendment. Okay. Notice you specify defects. You're objecting to defects. How repairs are going to be made, how those defects are cured, there's no place for that in a notice. You don't get to specify how a defect is going to be cured in a notice. You just get to say, I'm objecting to that defect. In an amendment, you're not objecting to defects. In an amendment, you're specifying repairs. So when you say the inspection contingency is satisfied, think of it this way. It's like the inspection contingency never even existed. It was never part of this offer. So for example, the standard of making repairs in a good and workmanlike manner, that is wording in the inspection contingency. So if you write an amendment that says inspection contingency is satisfied, seller shall repair the following defects. You could say that and then list the defects, because at least you're specifying the seller shall repair the following defects. Okay. You're not specifying how. In an amendment, you should specify how, or you should specify the standard. The assumption is they would have to do it in a good and workmanlike manner, but that is not true, because that good and workmanlike manner phrase from the inspection contingency does not flow over to the amendment. So when you do an amendment and you specify repairs, that is no longer part of the inspection contingency. So think of it as its own thing. Questions on that? Okay. Also, good and workmanlike manner. What does that mean? Do a pretty good job. I mean, really, I Googled it one day because I was honestly didn't know. So I'm like, what really does this mean? It took me about 15 years to actually Google it. And it means the way that a reasonable contractor would make this repair locally. So that it may be different in different parts of the United States, but it basically means do a decent job. It doesn't necessarily mean has to be a licensed electrician. That sometimes that makes sense. Sometimes maybe it's not necessary. Let's see. This amendment is outside of, not related to the, touched on that. Seller agrees to complete the following repairs and to provide paid receipts no later than 3 days prior to closing. I like that. But then each individual repair, you would specify how, because there's no good and workmanlike manner. You could simply add, seller agrees to complete the following repairs in a good and workmanlike manner and to provide paid receipts no later than 3 days prior to closing. Don't say within 3 days prior to closing. I see that fairly often too. It's just kind of a typo or a typing or writing it out, not really thinking. Within 3 days prior to closing means if you do that 4 days prior to closing, you're in breach of contract. So no later than 3 days is different. Make sure that's the deadline. Should you reference the inspection report in an amendment? I would suggest you do not. When you reference the inspection report, it becomes a part of the offer, and the lender is going to say, I need to see the copy of the inspection report. And then those 10 items that you didn't ask for but are in the inspection report, the lender is going to say, ooh, we need those fixed or we're not going to give you a loan. So just don't create that problem. So keep it out of the amendment. In a notice, that's fine. Generally, you will reference the inspection report in a notice because you're referencing the items that you're objecting to that are identified in the inspection report. So with a notice, generally you would. This is a sample how to do an amendment or wording for an amendment. The inspection contingency is satisfied. Seller shall credit buyer $1,000 at closing. Seller agrees to make following repairs and to provide paid receipts no later than 3 days prior to closing. I didn't say good and workmanlike manner here, but for the first one, hire a licensed electrician to correct the double taps in the breaker box. Okay, I'm fine with however the licensed electrician decides to do it. I'm fine with that. Hire a qualified roofer to repair the flashing around the chimney. Qualified is a little loosey-goosey, but that's really hard to nail down. And unless you know exactly what the repair needs to be, it's never a bad idea to say in a good and workmanlike manner. It's not always necessary. Be careful though. It's not always a good idea to get too specific. If you get very specific, you think you know what needs to be fixed and you say, do this, and the seller has that done, but it didn't fix the problem you were trying to fix. We go back to the amendment. What did you ask them to do? Did you ask them to stop the leak or did you ask them to replace that one shingle? So be careful with how you word it. Sometimes getting specific is not a good idea. Secure the downspout on the northeast corner of the house. I don't care if the seller does that. That's fine. So I didn't say hire a qualified contractor to secure the downspout, but make note of that. Is it okay if the seller does it? If so, don't require a licensed contractor to do it. Notice and amendment. These can be sent at the same time or one before another. You can do a notice and then you can do an amendment after the notice is given. You can do the amendment first. You can do them both at the same time. It's a good strategy to do them both at the same time if you're running short on time, unless you don't want to open up the option for the seller to terminate. But that's why you don't want to run out of time. This can also be used to emphasize the buyer's willingness to walk away if the defects aren't cured. As a listing agent, as a seller, I know that if I get a notice objecting to defects, they just allowed me to kill the deal. That tells me they're willing to walk away. And if I'm a seller looking at a notice with 20 things on it and an amendment that says we'll move forward if you fix 5 of them, right? It tells me that the buyer's more serious about getting those fixed. The notice and amendment, they don't have to note the same things. One is notice is defects, amendment is repairs, but they don't have to be the same thing. Notice of defects. You cannot specify how repairs are to be made. Hire an electrician to repair the double tap breakers. That's not okay to say in a notice. You can say that in an amendment, but not a notice. You cannot request or specify credit in a notice. You can only specify what defects the buyer is objecting to. In the offer, it says a copy of the written inspection report and a written notice listing the defects identified in those reports to which buyer objects. We can only object to defects. This is probably the #1 thing that gets done wrong when agents do notice of defects, because they're just not done very often. In a notice, it is okay to reference and I would suggest that you don't necessarily have to, but if you're doing a notice, you want to make sure you're at a point in a transaction. You want to dot all your I's, cross all your T's. So I would recommend doing it because what the offer says is identify which items in the report you're objecting to. So I would recommend referencing the report. Okay, buyer wants to list an item in the notice of defects. You know this item is not a defect. Can you include it in the notice? Not only can you, but you should include it. You're working for the buyer. Buyer tells you to do something, you do it. You know, as long as you're not breaking any laws or code of ethics, I would certainly have a conversation with the buyer and let them know this isn't a defect and what might happen if you're putting things in there that aren't defects. And I think we've probably all seen this when a buyer's trying to get out of the deal. Put everything in the kitchen sink on that notice. I want to let them know that I want out of this deal. And that's oftentimes when we see that. And the ramifications are the listing agent and the seller are going to say, well, that's not a defect. And then we're kind of at that point where, well, we need to figure it out, or the buyers need to lawyer up. Okay, lines, let's see, 207, 208 in the single family residential offer. That this is where it specifies if you're delivering notice, written notice, listing the defects identified in those reports to which buyer objects. And caution, a proposed amendment is not a notice of defects and will not satisfy this notice requirement. Now, in class, it's very easy to go, of course, that makes sense. This happens. It happens from veteran, longtime agents, and it happens all the time. Somebody thinks an amendment serves as notice. It does not. And then here's a sample of how a notice might look. I think it's good to have a sample. Anybody who wants these slides, just email me. I'll send them out to you. So you'll have all these samples, but just says, per the inspection contingency, buyers objecting to the following defects identified in the inspection report by such and such inspector, dated such and such. And then item 4.2, a quick little reference to what that is. So I'm just objecting to defects. But don't repeat what's going to happen next, because it's already stated in the offer. All that you have the right to do per the offer is give a written notice objecting to defects. That's what we're doing here. Seller's options after a notice of defects. Now, for this discussion, the assumptions are no amendment has been presented. The listed defects are not in dispute. Standard inspection contingency is used, not modified, not a separate contingency, and seller has the right to cure. So a notice of defects, objecting to defects, has been received. Seller has the following options. They could elect to cure the defects. They could do nothing. If they do nothing, after 10 days, the deal is dead. It's just doing nothing is the same as sending a notice back, electing not to cure. It just takes 10 days for that to be triggered. If nothing happens in 10 days, or if the notice electing not to cure is done, cancellation agreement would still be needed, or you'd still want to get that after the fact. Essentially, the deal is dead. But again, as real estate agents, we can't say it's dead until we get a cancellation agreement. So make sure you still get that as well. Or a seller could propose an amendment. Seller gets a notice, they could propose an amendment back saying inspection contingency is satisfied, but I'll do this. So you can still negotiate after that notice is given, and it doesn't have to just be the buyer proposing amendments. The seller could propose amendments. Keep in mind, as you're going after the notice of defects is given, you have that 10-day clock as a seller. As you're going back and forth with that amendment, that's not changing that clock. If you don't get an amendment signed within that 10 days, you need to either elect to cure or not to cure, or do nothing, and then the deal is dead. So just keep in mind that time frame. Okay, this one is, if seller chooses elects not to cure the defects. I look back at the offer. This offer shall be null and void if seller delivers written notice that seller will not cure. Whenever I do these types of things, I don't know exactly how to do it. I go back and look. And for something like this, I just read the offer. Specifically, what is it telling me to do? Deliver written notice that seller will not cure. So my language is, per the inspection contingency, seller will not cure the defects. Simple, that's it. If seller elects to cure the defects, it gets trickier. The notice is simple, but then you have to follow through. So deliver a written notice of seller's election to cure the defects within 10 days of receipt of the notice of defects. Now jump ahead here. Right to cure. This specifies what the seller has to do if they elect to cure. Delivering written notice to buyer within 10 days, stating seller's election to cure defects. So I use that word elect. Per the inspection contingency, seller has elected to cure the defects. Simple. Now back to this one. Deliver the notice, complete the repairs in a good and workmanlike manner. That's known. Deliver to buyer no later than 3 days prior to closing a written report detailing the work done. I've never seen a written report detailing the work done. Now, I would argue that if you get an invoice or a paid receipt and there's some description in there, I would argue that that's a written report detailing the work done. So in many cases, that's probably okay. Keep in mind, unless otherwise agreed to in the offer, there's no mention in the inspection contingency that paid receipts are required. That's not what you have to provide. Now, the title company is probably going to want paid receipts or lien waivers. So you may have to provide those for other reasons, but not for the inspection contingency. That never states that anywhere in there. In our amendments, generally we'll ask for that, but not through the inspection contingency if we do the notice process. So back to this written report, if you're on the seller side and you think the buyer's looking for a way out of the deal and they're waiting for you to miss something, read the offer. It says written report detailing the work done. If it were me on the listing side, I would be writing up a report saying this is specifically the work done. So there's no question about that requirement was met. Now, again, I think an invoice including information about the work done, I think that's acceptable. I would argue that a paid receipt showing that such and such contractor, $100 paid with no information about what was done, that's not a written report detailing the work done. So just know that that's there. If you're on the buy side looking for a way out, if you have legitimate defects and the seller is electing to cure, keep an eye on, are they meeting these requirements? Are they doing it in a timely manner? Are they going to get it done no later than 3 days prior to closing?
And Tim, just to give you a little heads up, you have about 7 minutes till noon.
Cool.
On the last page, I don't think you mentioned it, but I apologize if you did. If you do the notice saying the seller elects to cure the defects, you also then include an amendment describing the work done if needed, or you just call it done with the notice saying, yep.
Oh, so the question is, if the seller elects to cure and you send a notice back stating seller elects to cure the defects, would you also include an amendment describing how you're going to cure those defects? That's the question? No. You could. I mean, if you're wondering, should I fix it this way? Should I fix it that way? Sometimes everything's friendly and a seller wants to do right by the buyer and make sure they're okay with it. And you could certainly propose an amendment for whatever reason. If you want to do something different.
You list everything, but really 5 of them are the most. So then if that's what you're moving on.
So if you, as a seller, you receive a notice with 20 items objected to, when you elect to cure defects, it's all of them. Now, could it be argued that I'm electing to cure the defects and you do 15 of them, and before closing, the buyer says, well, you didn't fix those 5 things. And the seller could say, well, they're not defects. I fixed all the defects you objected to. And now we're back to, okay, maybe the seller's right, but that doesn't do us any good, right? So we need to work those things out. Really, if they're not, that's a ambiguous area or a gray area, they may need to hire attorneys. If the seller says there's 20 things on here, there's only 5 legitimate defects, I can't agree to do all of those. When they elect to cure, are they agreeing to do all of those? Now we're getting into, we need an attorney consult. So, but generally, no, because a seller wants to retain the option of, I just need to fix this in a good and workmanlike manner. You don't want to really pigeonhole yourself into how that needs to be done. Okay, we're almost done here, and we have to be done in a few minutes. Okay. We did that one. Seller was a licensed electrician for 30 years. No longer holds a valid license. One defect was a non-GFCI protected outlet. The seller made this repair. Was this repair made in a good and workmanlike manner? Well, first of all, does good and workmanlike manner even come into play? For example, if there's an amendment that was agreed to that says seller shall hire a licensed electrician to make the following repair, in that case, that would not be acceptable because it says they would hire a licensed electrician. But if we go the notice process and the standard is good and workmanlike manner, I would argue that, well, he's not a licensed electrician anymore, but he's probably better than most with all the experience. So certainly I would say that was probably done in a good and workmanlike manner. Again, a bit of a gray area, but probably acceptable. We talked about this. What if not everything on the list is really a defect? We touched on that. And time-wise, we have 4 minutes. I'm not going to get into this because it's messy and not that important and just a kind of a fun discussion. So I'm going to jump down here to thank you for attending. Any questions in the Zoom world or here? Does anybody have any questions?
Or comments or complaints?
No complaints. Complaints, send to Dan. Anything good to say, send them my way.
Great class today, Tim. Thank you.
Thanks, Malik.
Malik, awesome. Thank you.
Beth, thanks for the questions. Anybody else online? Lisa, we'll see you guys later. Thanks. Anybody out there on social land? There's 5 of you still sitting on, looks like, a couple of the different platforms. Is there anybody out there that can't unmute to ask a question that wants to ask a question? Nope. Rock and roll.
All right.
Thank you so much, Tim. Have a great week, everybody. I'm just going to wrap up a little bit here just by saying this is the difference between real estate pros and real estate amateurs that everybody's been talking about. It is December 14th. If you're in here training today, you're a true professional. We couldn't be more proud to be associated with somebody who in mid-December is taking the time to do this. So thank you all so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, everyone. Okay, we're going
to. If you were just watching that live or you're watching this feed later, we do trainings like this just about each and every Thursday. Some are in person here in Madison, Wisconsin, but a lot of them we do feed out live like this. Feel free to ask questions or comments about this, even if it's days or weeks later. We certainly will get back to you and try and help you out if you're a real estate professional. And of course, we're always looking for the true professionals, like we just mentioned, the people that are putting in the work, the people that are learning how to do this the right way, the respectful, professional way. So thanks, and reach out to us if you have any questions. Take care.